Where did God come from? This deceptively simple question has challenged the minds of philosophers, theologians, and everyday believers throughout human history. It's a question that seems to trap us in an infinite regression. If God created everything, then who created God? And who created the creator of God? The question appears to lead us down an endless corridor of causes, with no satisfying conclusion in sight. Where did God come from? This deceptively simple question has challenged the minds of philosophers, theologians, and everyday believers throughout human history. It's a question that seems to trap us in an infinite regression. If God created everything, then who created God? And who created the creator of God? The question appears to lead us down an endless corridor of causes, with no satisfying conclusion in sight. The paradox of God's origin in pre-time existence. The very question, where did God come from, contains within it several assumptions that limit our understanding from the outset. It presupposes that God is subject to the same laws of causality that govern our universe, that like everything else we observe, God must have had a beginning, an origin story, a moment of coming into being. This assumption reflects our human experience, where everything we encounter has a cause and a beginning. The chair you sit on was manufactured, the tree outside your window grew from a seed, the planet we inhabit formed from cosmic dust, and even the universe itself appears to have begun with the Big Bang. Our minds naturally extend this pattern to God, assuming that such a powerful being must also have had a beginning. Yet this is precisely where we encounter the first profound paradox in understanding the divine nature. The God described in theological traditions across many faiths, particularly in the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is not merely another link in the causal chain of existence. Instead, God is portrayed as existing outside the system of causality altogether. Consider what this means. God is not merely ancient or long-lived. God is eternal. Not eternal in the sense of extending infinitely backward and forward in time, but eternal in the sense of transcending time completely. Time itself, according to these traditions, is not something that contains God but rather something that God created as part of the universe. Modern cosmology offers a helpful parallel here. According to our current understanding of physics, time as we know it began with the Big Bang. The question, what happened before the Big Bang, becomes problematic because before is a temporal concept and time itself began at this cosmic event. Similarly, asking what came before God, or where did God come from, becomes logically problematic if God exists outside the system of time that allows concepts like before and origin to have meaning. This idea finds expression in many religious texts. In the Book of Psalms, we read that before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. Psalm 90 verse 2. The phrase from everlasting to everlasting attempts to express in temporal language what is fundamentally a non-temporal reality, that God's existence transcends the boundaries of time itself. The medieval theologian Augustine of Hippo grappled with this concept, concluding that God exists in an eternal present, a state where past, present, and future are simultaneously accessible. In this view, God doesn't experience reality as a sequence of moments but beholds all of time in a single, eternal now. This is not merely poetic language but an attempt to articulate a mode of existence fundamentally different from our time-bound experience. This transcendence of time resolves the logical problem of infinite regression. If God exists outside the system of time and causality, then God doesn't require a cause in the way that temporal beings do. The chain of who made X, who made the maker of X, breaks when we reach a being that exists not within the chain but outside the entire system that makes the chain possible. To use an imperfect analogy, it's like asking who created a character in a novel. From within the story, it might seem logical to ask who created the hero. But the answer isn't found within the story's framework. It's the author, who exists in a dimension the characters cannot directly perceive or understand. Similarly, God is not merely another object within our universe requiring explanation but the very ground of existence itself. Biblical revelations of God's self-description as eternal and self-existent. When Moses encountered God at the burning bush and asked for his name, the response was profoundly simple yet cosmically complex. I am who I am, Exodus 3 verse 14. This self-designation reveals God not as a being who came into existence, but as existence itself, uncreated, self-sufficient, and eternal. This divine self-revelation continues throughout Scripture, where God describes himself as the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Revelation 22 verse 13. These descriptions aren't merely poetic. They're ontological declarations that God exists outside the constraints of linear time, with no beginning and no end. Philosophical and theological implications of a being that transcends time and causality. The concept of a necessary being, one whose existence is not contingent upon anything else, has profound implications. Everything in our observable universe is contingent. It depends on prior causes and conditions. But this chain of contingency cannot extend infinitely backward. Logically, there must be a first cause that is itself uncaused or a necessary being whose existence is self-explanatory. This necessary being is what the great traditions have called God. Not a God who evolved or was created, but the ground of all being itself. As theologian Paul Tillich expressed it, God is not a being but being itself, the underlying reality that makes all other existence possible. The question, where did God come from, ultimately dissolves when we understand that God doesn't come from anywhere. Rather, everything else comes from God. Our very capacity to ask such questions exists only because the eternal I Am has granted us the gift of being. In contemplating these mysteries, we don't arrive at easy answers, but at a profound humility before the ultimate reality that transcends our finite understanding, the one who was, and is to come. Throughout sacred texts, God has not left humanity without testimony regarding his nature. The divine self-revelation consistently emphasizes one crucial aspect. God exists as the eternal, self-existent foundation of all reality. These revelations aren't merely abstract theological concepts but direct communications where God explicitly describes his own nature. The most profound of these self-revelations occurred at Mount Horeb, where Moses encountered the burning bush that was not consumed. When Moses asked for God's name, essentially asking for God's essential nature, the response was extraordinary. I am who I am. Exodus 3 verse 14. In Hebrew, this is rendered as YHWH, often vocalized as Yahweh, a name derived from the verb to be. God identifies himself not by relation to other beings or by function, but by his very existence. This name reveals God as pure being, pure existence, not a being who became or was created, but being itself. The name deliberately avoids any hint of derivation or dependence. God doesn't say, I was made by, or I came from, but simply I am. This self-designation stands in stark contrast to the created gods of surrounding cultures, whose mythologies included elaborate origin stories. The divine self-revelation continues throughout Scripture. In Isaiah 44 verse 6, God declares, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me there is no God. This isn't merely asserting uniqueness but describing a cosmic reality. God encompasses all of existence, from beginning to end, without himself being bounded by either. Similarly, in Revelation 1 verse 8, God is called the Alpha and the Omega, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. These descriptions place God not merely at the beginning of time but as the encompassing reality within which time itself exists. When Jesus was challenged regarding his authority, he made the startling claim, before Abraham was, I am, John 8 verse 58. By using the divine name, I am, rather than the expected, I was, Jesus wasn't merely claiming to predate Abraham but was identifying with the eternal divine nature. The reaction of his listeners, they picked up stones to execute him for blasphemy, confirms they understood he was claiming the eternal self-existence of God. The Psalms further elaborate on God's timeless nature. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Psalm 90 verse 2. The phrase attempts to express in temporal language what is fundamentally beyond time. God's existence has no beginning point and no ending point. Even these descriptions stretch the limits of human language, which is inherently temporal in its structure. The Apostle Paul describes God as immortal, invisible, the only God, 1 Timothy 1 verse 17, and as the one who alone has immortality, 1 Timothy 6 verse 16. These descriptions point to God's unique self-existence. Unlike all created beings whose existence is derived and dependent, God's existence is original and independent. Perhaps most striking is God's declaration in Isaiah 43 verse 13. Even from eternity I am He, and there is none who can deliver out of my hand. I act, and who can reverse it? Here, God explicitly states His eternal nature. From eternity I am He, while connecting it to His sovereign power. God's eternity isn't merely an abstract attribute, but the foundation of His absolute authority over all creation. These self-revelations aren't merely theological abstractions, but have profound implications for human understanding. They suggest that the ultimate reality behind the universe isn't an impersonal force or a being that evolved over time, but a conscious, eternal I Am, who exists necessarily and independently. This self-existent God doesn't require explanation because, as the ground of all being, God is the explanation for everything else. In these revelations, we find the answer to where did God come from? God didn't come from anywhere because God is the uncreated reality from which all else comes. As Augustine of Hippo observed, God did not begin to be, but He who is has been eternally. The biblical testimony consistently presents God not as one being among many, even the greatest, but as being itself, the necessary foundation without which nothing else could exist. The concept of a God who exists beyond time and causality isn't merely a theological assertion but has profound philosophical implications that resonate across both religious and secular thought. This final dimension of our exploration takes us into the deepest waters of metaphysics, where we confront the ultimate questions of existence itself. Throughout history, philosophers have recognized a fundamental problem in explaining reality: the problem of infinite regression. If everything must have a cause, and that cause must itself have a cause, we face an infinite chain stretching backward without resolution. This creates what philosophers call an explanatory regress that ultimately explains nothing. Three possibilities emerge. Either the chain of causes extends infinitely backward, infinite regress, or it circles back on itself, circular causation, or there exists a necessary first cause that doesn't itself require a cause. The concept of God as eternal and self-existent aligns with this third option, what philosophers have termed the necessary being. Unlike contingent beings, those that might not have existed or might cease to exist, a necessary being exists by its very nature. Its non-existence is logically impossible. The medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas articulated this in his famous 5 Ways, arguing that the chain of contingent beings logically requires a necessary being as its foundation. This philosophical concept finds expression across diverse traditions. In Islamic philosophy, particularly in the works of Avicenna, God is described as Wajib al-Wujud, the necessary existent, whose essence is identical with existence itself. In Hindu philosophy, particularly Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is understood as the fundamental ground of being that transcends all dualities, including time. These parallel developments suggest that the concept of a necessary, transcendent ground of being emerges naturally from deep philosophical reflection across cultures. Modern physics has inadvertently provided new ways of understanding these ancient concepts. With Einstein's relativity theory, time lost its absolute character and became part of the fabric of spacetime, a dimension of the universe rather than its container. If time itself began with the Big Bang, as contemporary cosmology suggests, then whatever caused the universe to exist must transcend time. The very question, what existed before the universe, becomes meaningless if time itself began with the universe. This scientific perspective offers a fresh way of understanding the theological claim that God created time rather than existing within it. The philosopher William Lane Craig has argued that God's relationship to time may be understood as timelessness prior to creation, in a logical rather than temporal sense, and temporal existence subsequent to creation, a perspective that integrates both the transcendent and immanent aspects of divine being. The implications of a timeless, necessary being extend beyond metaphysics into ethics and meaning. If the ground of all existence is personal rather than impersonal, a conscious I Am rather than an unconscious force, then meaning, purpose, and moral values may be understood as intrinsic to reality rather than merely human constructs. The philosopher Immanuel Kant recognized this connection when he posited God as a necessary foundation for objective morality. Perhaps most significantly, the concept of God as the necessary ground of being addresses the most fundamental existential question. Why is there something rather than nothing? This question, which the philosopher Leibniz considered the ultimate metaphysical question, finds its answer in the necessary being whose existence requires no external cause or explanation. As the theologian Richard Swinburne argues, God provides the ultimate explanation that terminates the otherwise infinite regress of explanations. This understanding transforms our original question. Instead of asking, "Where did God come from?" a question that mistakenly treats God as another contingent being within the causal chain, we might better ask, why does anything exist at all? The answer, according to this philosophical tradition, is that existence flows necessarily from the nature of the necessary being we call God. The philosopher Alvin Plantinga has further developed this concept through his ontological argument, suggesting that a maximally great being, one possessing all perfections including necessary existence, must exist in all possible worlds if it exists in any possible world. This sophisticated reformulation of ancient arguments suggests that God's existence may be not merely factually true but logically necessary. These philosophical reflections don't prove God's existence in a mathematical sense, but they demonstrate the profound coherence of the concept of a necessary, timeless being as the ground of all contingent reality. Far from being an arbitrary theological assertion, the concept of God as self-existent addresses fundamental philosophical problems that would otherwise remain unresolved. In contemplating these mysteries, we ultimately confront the limitations of human understanding. Our minds, conditioned by time and contingency, struggle to fully comprehend a being who transcends both. As the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein observed, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." Perhaps the most appropriate response to the mystery of divine being is not further analysis but reverent wonder before the ground of all that is. The question, where did God come from, ultimately dissolves when we understand that God doesn't come from anywhere. Rather, everything else comes from God. Our very capacity to ask such questions exists only because the eternal I Am has granted us the gift of being.